I think it's time for some political philosophy. Or economic political philosophy. In particular, one of the things that came to mind for me is that there's nothing new under the sun. While I was taking a dump and bathing afterward. The best thinking. So, what I was doing was aligning the fairly well-known view that essentially Marxism comes from the scholastic theory. And I was looking at the idea of sort of unconstrained capitalism and how that reflects possibly a good example of it is that early to mid, really the middle, because we don't know much about the early Roman Republic era, and quite possibly eras in a number of other locations of similar state. I'm not quite sure how you want to try to fit, say, Genoa or Venice into this, where you had similar government forms in these states, where there was an oligarchy of the wealthy. So you might think that they're similar. I don't know enough, except that they were mercantilist societies that you would assume are run heavily by the interests of capital in the same sort of way. Now, the Roman Republic was very definitely a matter of wealth controlled what decisions were made, with always the constraints, reins of, hey, the public might just riot and kill you at any moment, right? So we got to give them something, We can't just bilk them continuously and let capitalism run unrestrained. And I don't think capitalism has ever run unrestrained anywhere except maybe on Crusoe's planet and other game-like situations. I think anytime, you might see it, no, because always, I was going to say you might see it in organized crime, but no, because always the threat of force is brought in from one direction or another. No one can have what they want. But anyway, philosophers have often looked at Marxism and said, this is kind of interesting. It derives from Aristotelian logic through the scholastic period, and then you have the Enlightenment, which wipes all that out. And what happens during the Enlightenment? Well, the elevation of a middle class. Actually, this all came from musing to myself about how Venezuela went so terrible. I lived in Venezuela when I was 5 years old for a year, and I have seldom seen images of such poverty, and this was in the wealthy height of Venezuela, when it was considered, a proto-capitalist, one of the good guys, although the population was definitely beginning to turn heavily against the United States because the poverty was so great. And I was kind of thinking about how terribly, the Chavez regime is viewed, but in a sense, what he did, from what I can tell, is he took a situation where people were all very miserable and briefly raised them up at the cost of the integrity of the society. Like, there was a very oligarchical, wealth-controlled, capitalistic society there, which was completely the poor had no voice and no power and couldn't control what was happening. And then they kind of rose up and bit by bit started throwing out the more capitalistic elements, and then eventually end up with sort of a democratic revolution that puts really a communist in place more than a socialist. But the two terms are kind of interesting. So, I mean, communism claims to be socialistic, right? And there is a point to that. There's sort of this socialism meter, and no society can exist without being somewhat socialistic. You look at Crassus and the fire department, the privately owned fire department that would show up at your door and say, well, you could have bought insurance, but if you want that fire put out, it'll cost you 4 times as much, or we can just sit here and watch it burn together. Certain utilities to the common good make sense for the government to pay for, and they could certainly be private enterprise. You've had situations where there's private policing, and stuff like that, especially in areas where the government cannot provide the level of policing that's needed. And you have this, businesses, banks have private security, What is that? Well, it's not quite the level of, say, when there were Pinkerton agents coming in and breaking strikes, but it's not all that different, right? They know that they have a government sanction for the type of business that they're doing, and that the society and the government as a whole have kind of agreed, yeah, they're allowed to have all this money in them, even if there are people outside who are starving right outside the door of the bank. The bank shouldn't, sort of almost morally shouldn't, take some of its money from depositors and hand it to those starving people. Even though there would be other, there are certainly other moral terms where even if, this is other people's property, but I should be giving this away, would be the morally correct action today. And of course, like all my rants, I lose my train of thought and wander down one alley after another to mug myself. But anyway, this thought about Venezuela and how, what Chavez did was sort of a leveling, and to some extent, yes, he did bring people up on the income of the oil capacity there. Just, I mean, rich natural resources can be exploited, but they are a risky thing to exploit on. You become sort of a mono economy, and if that market collapses, everything's gone. And it's very hard. An authoritarian regime can do that, and can, will often be able to harness a singular economy like that. It's much, much more complex to harness a multifaceted economy, or to build a multifaceted economy out of one of these mono economies. And you see places like Saudi Arabia who are trying to do this, saying, hey, oil is going to go away. Not just that we're going to run out, but the world's demand for oil is going to go down, because eventually we will realize that, we're killing ourselves in terms of the impacts on the environment. And there are economic alternatives that are working to some extent or another. And there will probably be better and better technological economic alternatives that will blow away the burning of fossil fuels in the not too far future. So, they're taking kind of that wise move that you don't usually expect, that kind of enlightenment from these authoritarian regimes. And they haven't until now. And one of the dangers of doing that is that you have to kind of build up that middle class, and you have to build up that multifaceted economy that sort of supports itself out of nothing, kind of. Kind of like money is, it's no longer the faith on the government, and it's certainly not, hey, there's some gold in the bank. It's actually the faith in the banking system and the loans and the credit that's available that generates money, and it's about as solid as, the idea of, yeah, well, I had my computer do some computations and, created this blockchain. Therefore, that should be worth something. Why? Well, because it's unique. There are unique things that aren't worth anything. But it's because everybody agrees to. So let's go back. Back to my Venezuela example, which isn't the point of all of this for whatever reason I ended up there. So yeah, I mean, there was some degree of rising the waters for everyone, and cutting the very wealthy. Definitely, no question of that. And to some extent, it looked like, whoa, a star of the sort of real far on that socialism meter. And like I said, it is a meter. Are you providing police? Are you providing fire? If not, then you have anarchy, and something will get sucked into that vacuum and start providing these services that are needed. But at some point or another, there are services that we are willing to just pay for on a pay-as-you-go type situation, which is what capitalism really is, right? The taxes that we pay to the fire and police department are not a capitalist functionality, and what we do to, in a sense, honestly, there's something very twisted because the government and because other obligations are involved, even in healthcare. Hospitals will not turn away, for moral reasons or legal ones, they will not turn away somebody who's ill and needs help. But then they create this debt that person can't possibly pay off, and somebody's got to cover it. And it's either got to come from the government, or it comes from the insurance companies. But in either way, it's not a truly capitalistic mechanism of exchange in play here. We're not saying, yeah, you really wanted me to care for those people, any more than it would be capitalistic for the bank manager to walk out with $2,000 every day and hand it out to the local homeless people who are sitting around near the bank because they know they're going to get that, whatever. That also would not fit that capitalistic moral system. And I call economics moral systems because they really are. We have to look at what the society values and what it does not, right? And our society's utmost value seems to be money. There are other things involved in it. But even if you are a giving and very Christian person or whatever, but if you are a very generous person, what are you generous with? You're generous with your money or with something that can be evaluated for money, like your time or whatever. We take military service, and, back in the Civil War, you could pay off your military service with money. Well, that's a little crass. That was a little crass for our draft when we hit into the 1960s. So we had other ways where that money could be slipped around to the right people to make sure it happened. It wasn't anymore just as simple, you could hire somebody to sit in your place there. Instead, you went to school, and that was how you hired your way out of it. Or you went to a doctor and paid them to find something wrong with you, or whatever. But, money has been, for quite some time now in this country, certainly throughout my life, but I think well before that, the single moral imperative. And when we look at our most powerful people in our society, right? Because corporations are people too, and there are corporations that are in the United States that are essentially larger than most most national governments. Things like Exxon and whatever. Well, those are very, very powerful people. And you also have some people who have a lot of money, like a Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos. To take two people who maybe have different views of what they should use their ultimate value for, right? You know, Gates goes around trying to cure diseases in Africa. Bezos, I don't know, oppresses workers and buys the Washington Post because journalism's important to him, or liberalist journalism is important to him, however you want to look at that. But at the core, all of our exchanges are in money. Now, if you look back in the Middle Ages, and we'll be getting there at some point, because that was sort of the key point to this, was this comparison of the three different economic systems and where they fit in the moral line of things. In the Middle Ages, money wasn't necessarily, there were times when money was definitely important, and in the same way there are other goods, I think goods is the right word, that were viewed as important as the money, right? So the biggest and clearest of those is, of course, your relationship with God, you know. And at the highest level, the Pope was seen as perhaps the most powerful person in Western Europe, or in Europe. I'd stick to Western Europe because we don't have too many Catholics in Eastern Europe, and the Patriarch is subject to the Emperor. But you had a similar hierarchy that was also justified not by how wealthy a person is, but by their divine right. Again, it was this personal relationship or link to God, this anointment of some sort or another, that was the greater good than money. And, you know, people would waste huge fortunes and destroy the economic health of their country for matters that relate more to that glory, or to the glory of God, or to the glory of their soul, stuff along those lines. And of course, if that's your goal, and you have a Christianity at the foundation that's based on these teachings that wealth isn't important and that you should help the poor and everything like that, well, you still end up with an underclass, but you do end up with things that serve as something of a break on just how bad it can get. Now, how bad can it get? Well, it's pretty damn bad, because the problem was the society as a whole was stuck in this situation without the motivations, etc., that the rampant capitalism provides. You know, that rampant capitalism, like I said, gets you this building of the potential of a building of a middle class. Now, I would argue that that middle class can't really happen under a purely capitalistic system. The reason being that that oligarchy of power and money is able to essentially sit in an ultimate position of power, and unless they have some other moral facet coming in and influence, I mean, I'm not saying that there's not, I've already admitted there are other moral imperatives coming in. It's just which is the greatest good, and that's the one that's generally going to win out. And in our society, that's money, and I would argue up to the throughout most of the Roman Republic period, it really is money and maybe power in the Republic, because being that first man in Rome is so vital, right? You know, being the person who everybody respects and who can call together, you know, maybe you don't have the most cash, but you can get people who do to support your cause. So there's kind of a weird balance there, because by the time you get to that late Republic, you've already got a fair amount of socialism in place there, right? You've had a strong middle class, and that's conducting mercantile activities, etc. That's creating this broader base of wealth across the society, but you have a fair amount of different social goods that are being provided by the government, or, and this gets a little trickier, by the moral imperatives of the society as a whole. And that's the whole thing. You can't look at just the government function all on its own. A society is an interwoven set of things, right? So if you take a look at Victorian England, right? At this point, you're just at the early point of Victorian England. Go back to the 18th century, the early industrial era. You're seeing this capitalism taking off hard, but at the same time, there are people who are saying, yeah, that's a little too much. We need something else. We need to maybe subscribe and get people to give some money to the workhouses. And of course, they're workhouses, so, they're expected that the people in them are working, right? And are kind of earning their keep, but we're helping these people who can't earn their keep on their own to do it under this more structured system. And then, maybe some of the very worst are being taken care of otherwise, but much, much less so. In fact, when you have Henry VIII, which I would say, you're not talking Enlightenment yet, but you're already talking about the destruction of that medievalist flow or current. You're talking about a situation where, hey, when he dissolved the monasteries, there was nothing to replace them to help the very poorest. And there were some attempts from then on to constantly form something that would, but it wasn't as it wasn't as strongly based on the same imperative as, say, the church had. Now, there are all kind of problems because the church is a hierarchical and completely autocratic institution. Of course, I think most things are when you start looking at them. It's very hard to find instances of democratic institutions that kind of evolve naturally. They usually evolve out of the better angels of philosophers sitting around saying, well, now, what if we did this way? And then, a bunch of people who are oligarchs try to fit that philosophy to their own existence, as we had with the formation of the United States. Where we had, a government for the wealthy, by the wealthy, right? But with some understandings that, we're not just going to make this for the wealthy, but there are some people who are beneath our worries, right? There are some, maybe they're not people in our view even. Some animals that are being, and that becomes a problem in and of itself. But we'll stay off animal rights there. But I do believe that links very closely with the idea of slaves as people. There's that same kind of lens was applied, and is it applicable to animals? I mean, obviously, people is people, right? But are there some level of animals that we should be treating better than we do, and what does that even mean? I don't know. Let's not go there. So anyway, I guess the main thesis that I'm looking at here is you have the Roman Republic facing this sort of capitalistic, mainly capitalistic bent on that meter. When you go to the empire, you move to a more authoritarian realm. There's still capitalism going on, but you're seeing something more like a government-supported socialism type thing, where, the army starts becoming more and more a fixed expense that has to be paid. And, where is that expense laid? Well, because this was a sustainable situation to maintain such a large force, it was laid not only on the poor, as would happen in much of the Middle Ages, but the taxation burden, or in many countries, the taxation burden was actually placed also on, with a skewing towards the wealthier people. The wealth had to pay a higher proportion, like our graduated taxes are. The very poor did not have to pay very much each. In fact, the very poorest were actually supported well before the empire by social programs, the bread and circuses. That's already in place. Some of it by the government, some of it by individual largesse. But it was understood that you could not have a city like Rome filled with an underclass if they weren't getting enough. Whatever that minimal level is to keep them from revolting, you have to give them, because otherwise they're just going to eat you. As the privileged, you will be food if you abuse your situation. And this is something I've referred to a few times, which is that FDR's great brilliance and some other of the oligarchical classes that have given a great deal or have bent a great deal towards socialistic views, their great brilliance is always protecting their own class from being overthrown, right? If you push those limits too far, if you make it too horrible, you have a situation where the underclass, which is much larger and much stronger, will simply, withdraw whatever support it has for this failing situation. Now, in good times, if you can keep that, the rising tide raises all ships, that can work from the top down to some extent, as long as the lower classes are never stressed too far. If they're stressed to the point where they don't have a roof over their head, they don't have food, they're having to steal to meet their basic expenses, or do things that are unacceptable at this point, organ harvesting crimes, prostituting themselves, whatever it is, if you're breaking their basic view of themselves as humans anymore, then you're looking at a situation similar to what Rome regularly faced with the grain riots, what the French Revolution caused, where you have an underclass that has just said, that's it, no more. And essentially that's what happened in Venezuela, although it happened in a more gradual sort of way. It was a, that's it, no more. So the greedier the oligarchs become, the more likely you're going to fall into that worst case situation of the truly authoritarian type regime. But you didn't have that in Rome. Instead, you had that transition to, yes, there was an authoritarian rule, but there was also this socialism. And it was creeping socialism, which became quite heavy as the empire progressed in a lot of ways. And there, you could no longer fund it off conquest, right? That was always one of the things, was we were taking the rich East and taking the wealth from the East, etc., to make sure, and then subjecting it with the military force. Yes, I was a Roman senator, not that long ago, no. But I've left something out. I left out that true communism. And again, I look at where the Marxist theory came from, and it comes from that Aristotelian through scholastic stance. And what is happening there? Well, you have full-on mini-authoritarian regimes in the Dark Ages. I don't know how Christian they were. I don't know how much they set up that more powerful lodestone on the society as a whole. But once you have your larger kingships and most importantly of all, the church itself, sitting over everything. The church basically instituted a certain level of, this will be done for everyone. There is no one, someone can always go in and get some food. They might have to do some work for it. It's similar to the workhouse concept, if they are able. But you have there really that principle at the low levels of the two, each according to their needs, from each according to their ability, but not at the high levels, right? At the high levels, and you never have that. You don't have that in communist Russia either. The high party officials got a lot more than they ever needed. They maybe fabricated excuses of why they needed it. You could say the church did the same. We need the grandeur and splendor of God to be clothed upon our bishops, right? So that the people can see this difference. And, in a sense, that may just be a human, a part of the human nature. In the same way that, is there anything all that fantastic that certain exceedingly popular artists, not exceedingly important ones, not ones who are making great statements, just ones who are giving us the right earworm or whatever, or great athletes, are providing us? Well, to some extent that cloak that we put around them of wealth and fame, etc., may actually be the important thing, rather than their accomplishments. It's important to exalt certain people at that kind of level. I don't know. So, trying to figure out how I can tie together these churning thoughts in my head, because I think there is this general pattern of where the capitalist strain has a couple of ways it can go. If it fails completely, it breaks down and turns into the mob, which takes it too far the other way. And then you could actually get it swinging back and forth, or you could get some kind of stable situation like you have in the Middle Ages, and like maybe communism would have had if it hadn't had that exterior threat and the belief that it needed, to build up this huge army, which is against everything that it, espouses. And similarly, in the medieval period, the church, which was the communist, the strong socialist influence on society at that point, the government function that sat over everything and said, you must tithe 10% of your wealth regularly. This thing was what was in charge of that leveling, but it also kept everything down. It prevented that middle class from happening, and that's problematic towards the idea of progress and exploring different systems, etc. It's very stable, and similarly you have that with the water empires like Egypt or Babylon, where they can accomplish a tremendous stability. What did the church do? Well, instead of being a real physical good that they controlled like water, that was necessary for everybody's well-being, they made something up. They made this spiritual good that became the dominant feature of society. And you can say, you don't have to be a non-believer to see that. You could actually say, well, look, they were providing the gateway to this spiritual good that is real, that is the Word of Christ, and it was a necessity, and it was what we viewed as the important thing back then. Now, the strange thing is the modern Christian doesn't view the Word of Christ as anywhere near as important as they do money, and you can see that. I mean, you can see that by how they give to to what they give to the mega churches and what the mega churches do with the money. It's very similar to how the upper echelons in any communist structure, any authoritarian structure, to tell you the truth, are going to handle things. The wealth all devolves upon that small elite group that manages it. Whether it's the oligarchy through a capitalism, the nice thing about the oligarchy through the capitalism is that it is loosely held enough that it can never be fully stable, right? So that socialism meter can swing back and forth. If it swings too far one way or too far the other, though, you've got a problem. It's got to stay somewhere where the population is, and you can bend it pretty far, depending on how wealthy the society is. And our society was very wealthy, but now it's coming under the tax that is potentially very dangerous. We'll see how long it takes. But the dislocations, et cetera, that are happening, that were happening before COVID, by the way, were very, very impactful. And like with the period around a different kind of industrialization that was happening in the early 20th century, those dislocations were threatening a complete disruption of society already. And then we have this little thing that pushes it pretty hard and is pushing people who were close to the breaking point anyway over the edge. And that's all you need, you know? I mean, it's not like the French Revolution came in a good year. It came after several years of famine. It's not, and that's always the case. And what happens from there, whether you get something that's sustainable as what you probably get out of it is either a sustainable autocratic functionality or an anarchy situation like the Dark Ages that followed the collapse of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire, though, was it rotten, or was there something else in play? Was the wealth situation unreasonable and rotting? I'm not sure there. Usually the blame, historically, the blame has been laid on your barbarian invasions. Well, it turns out they weren't really the problem. The problem was societal rot pushed over the edge by a series of disasters, I think. Much like we're looking at right now. Much like every other civilization that seems to have fallen. The disasters happen. They're the thing that we put the exclamation point next to. The Sea People. Yeah, but there were bad years before the Sea People came up. There were problems. There were, climate change issues in place. And likewise, you have this regularly happening where changes in the climate, changes in the environment around you, that are not being reacted to properly, probably could not be reacted to properly. Maybe we could do it now, but we seem politically incapable of it. In conjunction with other things that shake shit up, caused the eventual collapse. And so I didn't end up where I wanted to with this. Not at all. And I'm not sure what to do about that. But I hear dinner being prepared. And I think that means I have to cope with that in some way. Well, I've been debating whether to even put this up because it's so useless. These are rambles more than rants when it comes down to it. But it definitely didn't head where I would have expected it to kind of conclude, which I'm not sure where that was, but it wasn't where it went. And I've been kind of thinking about it since after dinner and trying to figure out, hey, do I want to send this up? Well, fuck it. If people listen to my insane ramblings, whatever. But I think there is something important to try to take away from the thinking, which is once you get to a certain level of organization of society, all history kind of shows, and that level may be very, very low. All history kind of seems to show that the moral goods that are aspired to are, at best, things like respect. And this may be in any size society. But as you get larger and larger, those become less and less likely. Things like respect, a circle of friends, whatever, a family that's happy and comfortable. Yes, you still kind of pay lip service to them, but what the society actually values is not those things. As you get to a broader and broader society, you need a more equalizing measure of worth that the whole society sees as the great good. And that can be power over other people. That can be wealth. That can be fame to a limited extent. The truth of the matter is, fame is never recognized, I think, at the same level. Unless it's seen as something more than, our common glitz fame that we have now. Which is to say, it's more of a stepping stone, right? So like, your Marius, your Caesar, to go back to a certain level, their fame was one of the tools, along with wealth that they were able to accumulate, along with honor, that got them to the power. Now, you have individuals, your Cincinnatus, your George Washington, who maybe turned away from what we would see as the crasser, good. I don't know if the word good is right there. Our teaching tells us this is a vice to want this power, to want this money, to want, to want to go beyond, but what you're due, sort of, right? However, there's a lasting honor to those who do go beyond. One that stretches, and that although we revere it, we look at it in the way that we look at, the sainted Mother Teresa or whatever. And in a sense, in terms of like personal decisions, I would say that there's the same sort of selfishness in selflessness of that magnitude. It's the person who quietly continues their own life and doesn't engineer to make themselves into an icon of whatever they are, who is truly the epitome of that behavior. But it's all marketing. It's always been all marketing, right? It doesn't matter how good a person and caring a person you are and what good deeds you do, if you keep them at such a small scale that nobody notices them. And we've wandered into something completely different again. How much does the society value these things? Well, look at how the society rewards something to decide it. So, how is George Washington rewarded? Not badly. He was certainly treated with great honor during his lifespan. And afterwards, his name has become revered in the long term. And the same kind of thing with Cincinnatus. On the other hand, what can we look at, for, let's take a Stalin, who, much as I think he looks like a much nicer guy than any of the other world leaders of his time, was a heartless bastard, right? And not someone that any moral system would say, this is who you want to be like. And forever, for as long as he's remembered after his death, it will be as an evil person. Yet, in his own life, he may have had greater advantages coming to him than any George Washington did. And if he was truly the psychopath that he probably was, to rise to that position and be the way he was, it's not like he suffered probably any moral, struggles for that, right? Anyone who would have suffered such wouldn't have been able to become what he was. So then, obviously, the more mystical among us say, well, what payoff, what for the scorn of the future, of your name compared to the pleasures of your lifetime. And some people invent, imagine, perceive an afterlife in which, these very bad people are tormented forever. Being a mystic myself, with very little faith in the outcomes of my mysticism, I can understand that reaching, but it seems deluded to me, right? It just does. Yeah. Didn't they teach us this when they told us about Santa Claus and then ripped him away? And the Easter Bunny and the Tooth Fairy. Apparently, when I finally, at like 35, asked my parents to tell me the truth about Santa Claus, my reaction was, does this mean the Easter Bunny and the Tooth Fairy are fake too? I actually don't know how old I was, but it was way too old, right? Like we're talking like 8 or something like that. So again, I don't know where this has meandered and blathered away to. Again, the word rant is just wrong, and it always has been. Nothing of mine is a rant. I can get up a good rant sometimes, but it's hard in this format. I need the reaction of the audience for the rants to work. Every now and then you'll see it on a game. I don't know if this is of value to anyone, but I never throw anything away, so I guess up it goes.